Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Dealroom's podcast. My name is Orla Browne.
My name is Nina Chaloum.
And my name is Yoram Wijngaarde.
And today's episode, we're going to be unpacking the framework programs of the EU and what that means for startups. So it's an area that maybe lots of people are a bit intimidated about or don't fully understand. We've recently done a lot of work understanding it all ourselves, and so we thought we would share the love. So yeah, Yoram, do you want to take us through it?
Yes, so this is a report we did in March. So to kind of set the scene, let's start with Arm. So Arm is one of the most successful tech companies in Europe. They're responsible for designing chips that go into most of our phones. It's worth over 150 billion. One of the co-founders was Herman Hauser. And as he mentions here, Arm was an important beneficiary of one of the earlier EU framework programs. And according to Herman, it was really played an important role in the early development of ARM. So it's like a massive success story. The second one is BioNTech. So BioNTech in 2008 got significant funding from the private sector initially, from some wealthy biotech entrepreneurs, but they were following, at the time, very long shot strategy, like developing mRNA, which of course now is widely used, but back then very few people believed in it, and it took them more than 10 years before they made any significant money. So during those early years, also BioNTech received significant funding from the EU. So those are like two massive examples where EU funding played an important role.
And there's a lot of maybe skepticism by some people about the overuse of government money in startups in Europe in particular. But actually, this proves like two of the most important areas, vaccines and chips. It was crucial that there was actually European involvement.
Exactly. There's always many skeptics as soon as you talk about this topic, but then there's countless examples also in the US and in Israel and all over the world where you have these counter examples. Yeah, so we did a deep dive into framework programs. And let's start by just giving an overview. How does all this stuff actually work? How does the EU and the European Commission fund innovation? Within the EU, every nation contributes a bit under 1% of their GDP. So they kind of donate that to the European Commission. It's 0.7% roughly of annual GDP, and that adds up to 120 billion a year. Then the EU also has its own ways to collect revenue from VAT and customs duties. That's another 50 billion. And then during COVID, the EU started to issue bonds. They called it Next Generation EU bonds. They were AAA rated, heavily oversubscribed, so actually very popular. That was put into a special facility. So all of that, as you can see in the middle of this slide, adds up to about 170 billion a year, excluding the borrowing, and then about 100. You can add another 100 plus a year on top of that. That's like the total money that the European Commission has to spend every year. So where does this money go? And before I go into that, at the top of the middle, you see the EIB and the EIF. So that shows they are not part of that budget. So they are financed separately, but they do work together. Get back to that later. So of all this money, 30% goes to cohesion and regional development. You see that in the top right.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's basically redistribution of wealth within the EU. So kind of supporting poorer areas with the rationale of kind of, creating more stability, I think you could say, in the region. And the same happens in the US, by the way. There's a massive distribution of wealth happening from California and New York to rural areas.
And it's not just from rich countries to the poorer countries, but actually within the rich countries, some of the developing regions as well get lots of money from EU.
Yeah, but I do think a lot of it ends up going to Central and Eastern Europe and like places like Southern Italy. Yeah. But yeah, we can go into the politics of that. But yeah, maybe it is a good sometimes a good reminder that after kind of 2 world wars, like Europe was in shambles, extremely a lot of conflict happening. And that's how it all got started. Was the reason for creating this project. And in that sense, maybe it was a small investment to build cohesion literally in the region. Then another 30% goes to the agricultural sector, so supporting farmers. So these two are, also maybe somewhat controversial. And I think that Draghi has now argued for, reducing those two buckets and actually invest more in innovation and the green transition. But yeah, then you see the purple area, 10% goes into innovation, which includes Horizon Europe, Invest EU, Digital Europe, and the European Space Program, but also the CHIPS Act, for example. And then the next 10% green transition and climate, and then the rest other. Then for that 10% innovation, there are kind of three main structures. So there's the framework program that is currently Horizon Europe. And then you have the EIB and the EIF that are, again, separately financed. And I'll show on the next slide how. So, yeah, this is very...
this is the simple version. This is after you've figured out how it all works. This is...
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So this is as simple as you can make it. It's in the end, it's not that bad, I think. So at the very top, you have the 27 EU member states. They are funding the European Investment Bank, so they have provided capital to the EIB so that the EIB can function as a bank. So it functions as a normal bank, and its capital comes from the member states. And then they also put money into the European Commission. That's that budget that I showed earlier. And the European Commission then is organized into these directorate generals, which are kind of the equivalent of ministries at the EU level. There are 33 of those DGs. And the commissioner is a political appointee. And some of the DGs for innovation are DG Research and Innovation. And then you have DG Connect, or CNECT, that you probably have heard of. So then you see, then you wonder maybe about the EIF. So the European Investment Bank is 60% shareholder in the EIF. You see that in the bottom left. The other 40% is owned by some public and private institutions.
But I think, because the European Investment Bank is separated from the European Commission, so 40% or 27% is from European Commission.
You're right.
And then from a mix of other public funds like PPI France and some others.
Exactly, KfW, exactly, okay. Yeah, and then so EIF is widely known for the investments they make in VC funds. They also do venture debt and a bit of co-investing, so you can see that in the bottom left. Then the European Commission has kind of, on this chart, three main buckets. So there's Invest EU, that's like 26 billion a year. Then there's the EU CHIPS Act, 43 billion, and then the framework programs. And the framework programs, that's like the main instrument to support innovation, and that's like currently about 95 billion, spread over 7 years, by the way. So
I think a lot of people will have heard of Horizon Europe, but it's actually the 9th framework program. So there have been predecessors.
Exactly. So this is kind of an overview. So it started with framework program 1 to 6. That was about 60 billion over 22 years. I think they at the time had different lengths, But then in 2007, we started with the 7th framework program that was 50 billion. And then this 7-year cycle started. So there's a 7-year budget, 50 billion. So if you want to know by year, you have to divide 50 by 7. Then you had the Horizon 2020, that was 80 billion. And Horizon Europe, 95 billion, again, over 7 years. So just a bit more than 10 billion a year.
Yeah, and I think something that was important in the context of when we were working on this report is that it's kind of like there was a new commission that started last year as we were working on it. And one of the big goals of it inside of its startup strategy is going to be defining what the future program looks like. So I think we'll go into some of the like our recommendations on that, or Draghi as well recommendations on that later. But yeah, we should know more about this quite soon.
Do you know what the timeline roughly looks like?
I do think we're gonna see a first legislative proposal of what that's going to look like in this summer.
Okay.
And I guess there will be some reviews and other things. I don't know the exact timeline after that, but yeah.
They work in the summer?
I guess so.
Yeah, but at least we know that this future program will be bigger than the previous, likely.
Most likely, yes. And I think especially within the context of what the initiatives that the EU have taken in the last year, I think that would make sense.
Perfect. So, okay, so let's dive into Horizon Europe. That's because that's the current one that's currently active, and yeah, it's ending in 2027. So there are kind of 3 pillars. So the first one is around scientific breakthroughs. Within that, you have the European Research Council. That's 16 billion in total. Then you have this Marie Curie support researcher mobility and training. Then research infrastructure. So all that together is 25 billion of the 95 billion. Then there's pillar number 2. I see it says scientific breakthroughs. I think it means it's supposed to say probably innovation or something. I don't know.
Yeah, also research.
Yeah.
So the first 2 pillars are focused on kind of universities and research institutions rather than companies and entrepreneurship, right?
I mean, I would say the main difference in terms of the way the pillars work is that pillar 1 is mainly overseen by one single directorate, whereas pillar 2 is articulated in these different like sectors, and each sector will have several directorate that kind of oversee them. So it's more articulated by sector, and like the strategy is done on a sector basis, like for health or for climate. So.
Yeah, exactly. So pillar 2 is the biggest bucket by far. So it's more than half, and it's the most complex also. So yeah, this is done through calls for proposals. So everyone sees there's all the time calls for proposal for this, for that. There's a whole kind of industrial complex in Europe that's.
So is it people applying for contracts or applying for grants, or what does the?
Yeah, for both grants and these you have these consortia, and so all those things are in pillar 2. Yeah. And so and the interesting thing is that these are managed by these directorates generals, and so it's kind of managed by I think you can say politicians, or are they?
Yeah, I mean it's also per sector there might be several directorates managing, or like per, I guess, thematic areas there might be several directorates managing them. So it's a mix, but it's not going to be very industry people, I would say. Right. It's going to be a mix, but it's also like a lot of more like people from like a law background or politics.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's not, I think, totally transparent how those calls for proposals are created. So it's maybe the most opaque part. Yeah, and then pillar number 3, that's where you have EIC. that a lot of startup people know. So there it's again more organized, maybe like pillar number one is that you have a dedicated organization that's specialized, and it's they call it sometimes a one-stop shop approach. So as a startup, you go to the EIC and there are these programs that you can follow. So it's almost more like a accelerator idea.
And there you can get equity funding as well as grant funding. And
yeah, exactly. It's mostly 6.5 billion grants and 3.5 billion equity, total 10 billion. And then there is EIT, it's another 3 billion. And then there's this thing, innovation ecosystems. It's another 500 million, and it's total 13.5. Yeah. And then you have this horizontal program. So that's about supporting less developed regions. Yeah. So I think in a nutshell, it's a very dense page, but it's really interesting. So you have about 25 billion going to science. Then you have 54 billion that kind of goes to a huge variety of things, but importantly, there are like these calls for proposal attached to them, and then you have pillar 3, that's mainly the EIC and EIT. So in the report that we published in March, we definitely alluded to the next framework program. The 10th will probably be much larger. Like Draghi also recommended to double the size of the next framework program. And then we came with a recommendation to allocate a lot more to startups and scale-ups, and we'll get to why in a second. And the other recommendation was to make the application process even simpler. Although I think with the EIC, it's already a huge improvement versus these calls for proposals, because that just attracts kind of career tender applicants.
Companies that are big enough to employ somebody who can do that as their main job, just applying for tenders. Whereas a startup can be a huge investment to put that tender together, and then it might not come off.
Exactly, and we'll show in a second where all that money ends up going actually, because we did a lot of research on that. Maybe last thing. So now on the framework program. So with Horizon Europe, EIC, ERC, EIT, there you can see it kind of as a following every step of innovation. So kind of the research council being, at the concept generation, like lab testing, analytical proof. When you go towards prototyping, you get the EIC has different programs. They have this EIC transition, EIC accelerator, and Pathfinder is the first. So it's really a word soup of different programs that makes it really inaccessible. And for me, it was always like I didn't even, feel like diving into it, because it's just so many terms. And I think, my personal recommendation would be to stop giving brand names to everything, but just say what it is. That's kind of the Facebook method of naming things. Like the newsfeed is called the newsfeed. The Messenger app is called Messenger. Then so people don't have to learn like your terminology. There's already enough terminology.
Yeah, because it might not be a good investment of time to even figure out all of these things if you're a startup founder.
Yeah, you don't have time for that. So it's a huge turnoff. Yeah. And again, then you get this adverse selection program where you attract people whose full-time job it is to apply for tenders. Yeah, so let's dive into, where did this money actually go, and what has been the results, and what can be improved? So I think the one of the most surprising things is that only 5% of EU's direct innovation funding since 2007 goes to startups directly.
So 225 billion is all of the framework programs put together.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then
It's since FP7.
okay, since FP7.
Right. The last 3 programs.
The last 3.
And 12% of that we estimate went to SMEs. So massive proportion then going to corporates, universities, and R&D. but particularly on that corporate section potentially.
Yeah, we noticed that there are a lot of huge organizations that get grants in when they were already huge.
Yeah, I mean, it mostly comes from these call for proposals because they can involve these consortium of different actors, at least from the data I was looking at. So that can be any kind of actors, including like some corporates and universities and everything like that. So,
What are some examples of big companies that are hoovering up some of this money?
Ocado,
Mm.
there's so many.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, I don't have a precise example in mind, but even on what we consider kind of the startup side, some of those startups were actually already really large companies. Like obviously ARM is one of them. Like ARM was first founded by the EU for like its first framework program or something like that. But more recently, it also got some new funding via a call for proposal, like for a specific project. So like I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of the three last programs. So that could be an example of to show.
We're not necessarily saying that that's all bad, but it is kind of surprising that so much of the innovation funding goes to very large organizations that are not maybe necessarily known for being so innovative. And second issue is it's almost impossible to track what happened actually with that grant. So it's very intransparent. And I think the benefit of startups is that it is much more transparent. So thanks to data, you can map the exact journey of these startups. You know exactly when they got funded by the EU, then you know when private capital came in and how they developed.
You say thanks to data, but it's actually thanks to Dealroom data because we've combined these data sets for the first time.
Exactly, thanks to Dealroom data.
Yeah.
And thanks to Dealroom data, we can also track their fundamentals, which are increasingly important. It's not just about how much funding they raise, but are they actually making money? So we could exactly track how many of these companies reach 25 million or 100 million or even more. So there are 14 companies that are doing more than 500 million
in revenue.
In revenue, yeah. So that's pretty interesting. Thanks to the data, the Dealroom data, we can also see which countries, for example, get more attention from EU funding. And France and the UK are at the top. That's normal. Spain feels kind of weird because Germany, is much bigger. So somehow Spanish people are much more aware somehow of some of these calls for proposal.
You say it's kind of surprising. So we're kind of, because we're comparing it against what we would normally see in tech and startup stats, basically. So there in Europe, we would see UK, France, Germany, then Sweden probably at the top. And so, it's interesting that Spain is pretty high there. But then that's at the early stage. They're pretty good at getting this funding.
Yeah.
But when we track them through the pipeline, they haven't actually produced any of the unicorns yet, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So in the UK, we see 8 unicorns coming out of that. France 4, Germany 8, and Spain is at 0. So the in that sense, the return on investment seems to be higher in those countries. Sweden also doing quite well. And
I think Sweden per capita. I think Sweden would be at the top.
Yeah, probably.
At least of those top ones.
No.
And UK, even post-Brexit, has now rejoined the framework programs as well.
Exactly. Now, then you can, here we map it by sector. So you can see it's very deep tech, climate tech, biotech, heavy energy as well. So really different sectors than you would see if you would look at this map on a just European level. You would see fintech and other like e-commerce at the top. So this is really a different focus than VC generally. However, it does crowd in a lot of private venture capital. So these EU-backed startups have raised 70 billion total in venture capital since 2010. And here you can see it by year, so it kind of follows the same trend as the overall market. But yeah, there's significant investment in these startups.
Which kind of validates some of the companies that are being selected here, because if the private market follows in after.
Yeah, exactly. And then last but not least, if you look at the combined enterprise value of all these EU-backed startups, so framework program-backed startups, it's more than 500 billion in combined enterprise value and 600,000 jobs globally. So yeah, if you kind of sum all that up, 13,000 startups received about 12 billion in funding in the last 3 framework programs, so since 2007. So 12 billion coming from the EU, 70 billion raised from the private sector, from VCs, and has created so far 500 billion in combined enterprise value.
So super trackable, and it looks like a pretty good return on investment.
Yeah, it's yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not quite return on investment, but at least it's trackable, and it seems in aggregate to work. Yeah.
But it's only 5%, and the other 95% we don't really know what's going on there.
Exactly. Yeah. Couple of other data points. So this is like number of startups. About 10% of Europe's startups have gotten grants from the EU. It's mostly in space, semiconductors, biotech, so kind of hard tech sectors. Here you can see that the vast majority are building physical products, which can range from like advanced materials to hardware, but also like anything that means they're producing molecules and not just software. And despite this focus on more difficult tech, you see pretty good conversion rates from receiving a grant to Series A and Series B. So despite what you might think, startups that have received a grant from the EU are actually more likely to convert to a Series A, Series B, Series C round than Series D.
Maybe because they're on the deep tech side, it does that job of de-risking something that allows the VCs to come in a bit later on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, here what we compare is EU-backed kind of physical tech startups with also physical tech startups, just not the ones that are EU-backed. So we do see a clear difference in kind of the outcomes and the conversion rates for these EU-backed companies.
Yeah. I know that the folks within the EU were really excited to see this data. So it's a validation of the work that they're doing. Couple of other data points around kind of the relationship between spinouts and EU funding. ETH Zurich spinouts have the 110 ETH Zurich spinouts got also EU funding, so they're at the top. Here you can kind of see which universities and institutes have the closest connection with these programs. And like one of our recommendations also would be to probably create some kind of dedicated unit that focuses on spinouts. And I think here the point is most of the 13,000 startups that we identified, more than half are still early stage, didn't get funding yet. So this 500 billion in enterprise value has been created by older cohort companies. Like the best maybe is yet to come. So we're not done counting yet.
These are multi-decade investments that before we could get to see how they pay off.
Yeah, exactly. Like look at how like BioNTech and ARM are like super old. So that was kind of the quick rundown of the data. Now we should talk about kind of the next 7 years. So talk about also in light of what you just said, that there's now a new framework program being designed as we speak, and it's probably gonna look drastically different, and it will be really exciting to see. I think some people like who are in the Draghi camp and people who are more kind of looking at this from a distance will want massive changes perhaps, and to really have more of these kind of moonshot programs and like build AI factories and have this high ambition. But then there's a whole industrial complex also, and there will be a lot of lobbying, and who knows what kind of compromises we're going to end up with. So it will be interesting. But starting from the kind of Draghi point of view, so his report was about, okay, we have to be more innovative and competitive. We need cheap and abundant and clean energy. And then there's a whole resiliency and security and defense topic. So those were kind of his three transformations he talks about. Then kind of this industrial strategy that he recommends rests on a series of building blocks, starting with a full implementation of the single market, so removing friction. He sees it as a condition for more capital to be unlocked. Then on top of that, have certain industrial and competition and trade policies, so also allowing consolidation in certain sectors. And then only kind of if we can get the ball rolling on those two elements for more investment also to come. And that's where this 800 billion figure came from. That was all over the news. So 800 billion would be 5% of GDP. And so I wanted to kind of quickly go into what does 800 billion mean. It sounds like a lot. So the EU 27 economy, it's a 17 trillion economy. So it's about 17-18% of global GDP is Europe. And here you can kind of see how that is, what it's comprised of. So it's mostly a services economy. Then there's a bit of industry and agriculture. That's the blue part. In the green part, you can see how much is kind of goes to employee compensation and how much is kind of corporate profit, if you will. And then on the red part, you see where is this money going to. So it's consumption. Then there's government, and 3.7 trillion is investment. So of the 3.7 trillion in investment, I'm going to skip a little bit. What does that go to, and where does it come from? So this investment of 3.7 trillion comes from corporates, from government, and from households. Now, households normally tend to invest in unproductive assets like buildings, and especially in Europe, households typically don't invest much in equities. And then you have corporate and government that are responsible for kind of the productive investment, so in infrastructure and IT and machines and this kind of thing. So the idea is that households should be investing more in, instead of short-term financial assets, to put it into long-term assets, which would also include maybe some venture capital, like indirectly. Then government directly should invest more, and like especially think about like energy infrastructure, defense, education, like typical government stuff. And then somehow also to get corporates to invest more in, let's say, strategic domains. So similar to the way that, let's say, in the US, companies like Google and Microsoft are building, like cloud infrastructure. The idea is like European corporates should also like invest more in innovation and in technology. And so the idea is this 800 billion comes from all three of those buckets. And normally you would you would expect that about half of the 800 billion comes from government and the other half comes from the private sector. So it's about mobilizing the private sector and doing investments directly by the government. So he hinted at this 50-50 split, public and private sector. And then of this 800 billion a year, about 30%, so that comes on top of the budget that there is already, but it would be like a kind of quadrupling of the EU budget, basically. So it's like really a massive program. Well, it's not all their budget because it's also private sector. But it would be a massive additional investment. And so a third of it would go to innovation and technology, a third to energy transition, and then 10% to defense and security, although this was made in like almost a year ago.
Yeah. So some of the demands on defense expenditure might be changing some priorities here.
Yes. Well, yes and no. So
put it all into defense tech, and then it's solves two birds, one stone.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So it is actually, it goes hand in hand. But yeah, I guess maybe some of this would go to by building more tanks and actually building an army and paying salaries. So the mix, might have to change. Indeed. Some stuff going on around pension systems. The Europeans are saving a lot, but they're putting it normally into short-term assets. In the US, households are putting more of their money into the stock market. It is also maybe more attractive there because you have this union effectively. There are more investment opportunities and they tend to do better. So US households end up also with more financial assets.
And more debt. Which isn't that, but
that's because they consume a lot more. Yeah, that's true. So now people are really looking at there are other examples like Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands that look a bit more like the US, but then those financial assets to have a bit more of that also going really into innovative investing, like in basically financing innovation rather than just buying stocks of financial institutions that are not really like innovating that much.
Do we already see like foreign pension funds benefiting from European startups in terms of
benefiting?
Yeah, as in like, can they invest in European companies?
So I think there are mainly a lot of rules against doing that, and also appetite of pension funds to invest in venture capital is not it's not yet really there.
Not in Europe, but there is that culture more in North America.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the arguments have been made before of like there's a lot of the LPs in European funds are actually North American pension funds, and it's North American pensioners who are benefiting off the value increase of European startups, and European pensioners are missing out on that opportunity as well.
We can put an engine on a plane, but when the plane's ready to take off and fly around the world, we'll only be prepared to pay for 15 to 20% of the fuel. So the plane gets fuel, but the economic beneficiaries of the flight then are the Singapore metro system, a teacher in Ontario, a Danish nurse, the Saudi royal family, you name your list. So when I think about economic security, it's not just about the critical technologies. It's actually about, do citizens and savers in the UK, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany benefit from the innovation that's happening in their country? And they obviously only really benefit economically if the people who are allocating capital on their behalf, pension funds, insurance companies, or the state, are active investors in their innovation economies.
Like, I remember was like someone recently said that, that he felt like pension money shouldn't go into venture capital because it's too risky. But we're talking about a tiny allocation, and that would make a tremendous difference for the whole ecosystem. Plus the fact that it's like highly diversified, so we're not really talking about a massive risk, and it could potentially like transform the competitiveness and of the entire continent. So like Niklas Zenstrom says here, they're allocating 0.01% of their assets to VC, and like changing that to 1% would solve all of the capital gap that
And
exists.
productivity issues and everything.
Resolved instantly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, of course not. But it is. Yeah, you do need to invest in yourself, and that's what China also did. And otherwise, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it will be a little bit easier to navigate for people now, the different funding mechanisms of the EU. And also with the FP10 coming up, people will hopefully have an idea of what their wishes would be, because in the end, they're supposed to be doing it for all of us as citizens. So yeah, do let us know if you have any other questions, or you'd like us to crunch any other data. All the slides will be made available. And yeah, we're hoping to make it as transparent as possible where this money is going and the impact it has on startups and on Europe. And thanks for joining us.